Ever feel like the news is just arguments or nonstop tragedy? Plus, who has the time to keep up with it all? Well, I have a solution for you.
Welcome to The Newsworthy.
In just 10 minutes a day, The Newsworthy keeps you in the know about everything from politics to tech to entertainment, using its signature fast, fair, fun style. No wonder Harper's Bazaar, Fast Company, People Magazine, and more have called The Newsworthy one of the best podcasts to stay news savvy. Listen now by searching The Newsworthy in your podcast app or go to thenewsworthy.com.
Good day, all CHP listeners around the world. Laszlo Montgomery here with the launch of the next great thing here at the China History Podcast. So I'm happy to say there were no shortages of fine monographs, academic papers, videos, and documents to work with. This is a pretty well-documented history. But like it often is with world history, the farther back you go, the foggier and more speculative things are. And there's no way to tell Singapore's story without mentioning Malaysia and the Malay people. So for some of you who can't find Eastern or Western Malaysia on a map, you'll get a little bit of Malay history at no extra cost. At 720 square kilometers, Singapore's about the size of Bahrain, a bit smaller. There's about 5.5 million people living in Singapore. As for Bahrain, they got about 1.5 million. It sits right on the Sunda tectonic plate where most of Southeast Asia lies. This included the South China Sea, Andaman Sea, southern Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Cambodia, and most of Indonesia. The Sunda plate was a minor one, and thanks to the continental drift, before the land settled into what it is in our day, it got pushed around plenty by the surrounding Eurasian, Indo-Australian, and Pacific plates. When everything settled down on the Earth's mantle to where it is today, well, if it hadn't have been for Singapore's famous location at the southern tip of the Malaysian Peninsula, where the 500-mile-long Strait of Malacca joins the South China Sea, and its sheltered deep-water port, 1.29 degrees north of the equator, if not for all of that, Singapore may not have ever amounted to much. Ancient tablets with cuneiform writing written in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago mention the monsoon winds and how merchants utilized their regularity and dependability to sail great distances and engage in trade with faraway lands as far as the Harappan civilization in India. And in the centuries that followed since, these monsoon winds all got figured out. And from this force of nature evolved the trading networks that brought ancient economic growth and prosperity to all the ports and to the people who lived beyond those ports. And Singapore's location, right at the crossroads of these trade winds, made this place unique and special. Today, the estimated combined GDP of Southeast Asia's 6 core economies is about $4 trillion. And this is how it all began, with these nameless trading merchants from millennia ago who were explorers as much as they were traders. The term monsoon comes from the Arabic word mosim. The southwest monsoon usually began around April or May, sometimes as late as June. And Arab and Indian vessels, as soon as these winds started blowing, would ride them in the direction of China, across the Bay of Bengal and down the Malacca Strait, and ultimately to the Chinese ports of Guangzhou and Quanzhou. And when the winter northeast monsoon began, around November-December, everyone sailed in the other direction, back to where they had come from, until March-April when it was time to sail east again. These monsoon winds powered the maritime Silk Road in Southeast Asia and India and helped facilitate regional trade, providing the catalyst for the development of early Southeast Asian economies. You know, there used to be this narrative, well, for many it's still prevalent, which says that Singapore history began in February 1819 with the arrival of Sir Stamford Raffles. Well, as we'll see, that's far from accurate. Where Singapore's early history is concerned, it's not easy to say anything with any high degree of certainty about what happened during the Paleolithic and Neolithic times. There's the usual pottery shards and evidence of human habitation. But by no means was the future Singapore a thriving agricultural community developing along some great river. People lived on boats and made their living as seafarers. The earliest people who lived in modern-day Singapore, like most of the indigenous people of Southeast Asia, from Taiwan to Myanmar and beyond, were boat people. In Malay, they were called the Orang Laut. Orang means people, and Laut means the sea. And they lived throughout the Riau archipelago, which contains all the small islands off the Singapore and Indonesian coast, most notably Batam, Bintang, Karimun, and Lingga Islands. None of them left any historical records, but scientists and anthropologists know these people native to these lands stretching from Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, southern Thailand, and southern Philippines had been riding these trade winds since the times they were figured out. They were moving goods back and forth across maritime networks long before any of the great trading empires that thrived during the period of the Tang and Song dynasties in China, and certainly long before the Portuguese and the English and Dutch East India companies arrived. When these 9th and 10th century early traders called on the nascent ports of this part of Asia, the Orang Laut were the first ones they encountered, and who most likely served as guides and allowed these visitors from afar to get the lay of the land and obtain basic survival skills. And like a lot of indigenes, once their usefulness was exhausted, they got shunted aside and marginalized as far as the historical narrative went. The earliest settlement located on the island of Singapore was called Temasek. In the Chinese annals, it was written as Danmashi. In our time, we have Tamasek Holdings, the sovereign wealth investment company owned by the Singapore government, as well as its Temasek Foundation. There's also Temasek Polytechnic, a respected institution of higher learning in Singapore. And besides that, there are a whole myriad of other places and organizations that bear this name. That was Singapore's first incarnation and earliest known settlement. It was located at the mouth of the Singapore River, where it flowed into the sea, where today the iconic 8.5-meter tall Merlion statue is situated, as well as the Marina Bay Sands. When you find yourself in that part of Singapore, where Empress Place is located, and the Singapore Cricket Club, Queen Elizabeth Walk, the National Gallery, and Esplanade Park, stop for a moment and appreciate the approximate starting point in Singapore's earliest history. Yeah, there was something there centuries before Stamford Raffles arrived on the scene. Much to the chagrin of scientists and historians, all we know about that era comes from others. These early dwellers of Singapore didn't have a writing system. Not the end of the world, just because events were first recorded decades or centuries after they occurred doesn't mean there's no truth in what was written. Before we could start talking about the Temasek settlement, we have to go back in time to the commercial and maritime empire of Srivijaya. They were a thalassocracy, that is, their power came from their dominion over the seas and trade routes. They weren't interested in territorial conquests. Srivijaya was made up of a loose federation of city-states and vassals that recognized the supremacy of their government based in Palembang. As the crow flies, Palembang is about 470 miles due south of Singapore on the island of Sumatra. Their power and influence stretched all the way east to Borneo, even as far as parts of the Philippines. They were the commercial and economic powerhouse of their day, as well as a center for Buddhism. And because so many vessels from all over the region called on their ports, they were also one of the great exchanges of their time where cultures came in contact with each other, and everyone there would find all kinds of interesting things and ideas to take back to their land. At this time in history, Southeast Asia wasn't so much a region of cities as much as it was a vast network filled with trading centers and feeder ports. Srivijaya's time on the main stage lasted from 671 to 1025. In China, that would be the Tang, 5 dynasties, 10 kingdoms, and the Song. Again, well before the beginnings of the age of exploration that led to the arrival of the European traders. Srivijaya's hammerlock on trade in the region was the source of their wealth and power. But like it always was and forever will be, their greatness waned, and by the 11th century, Srivijaya, they were already starting their decline. The new rising power was the Singhasari Kingdom down in Java. Their years of conquest and splendor lasted between 1222 to 1292, the last decades of the Southern Song and the reign of Kublai Khan in China. Their warrior king, Kirtanagara, was the one who finished off what remained of Srivijaya, and this once great maritime power became a vassal of Singhasari. Whatever had once been theirs was now in the hands of this Javanese Hindu-Buddhist kingdom. Srivijaya's sudden decline caused a massive disruption in the centuries-old intricate trade networks of Southeast Asia, as one by one, all of these dependent ports detached from Srivijaya. And into this trade vacuum created by the fall of Srivijaya emerged several up-and-comers. Among them, in 1299, was Temasek, again, the first recorded settlement on the island of Singapore. The Sejarah Malayo, or History of the Malays, serves as a kind of record of the grand historian for the Malay people. A lot of what's contained inside the Sejarah Malayo isn't verifiable, but like so many of these old texts, we're still lucky to have it. The original text was written more than 600 years ago, and there were more than 30 subsequent versions produced since the original. But as far as this earliest history of Singapore and Malaysia, of course, all the history, myths, and legends spoken of today came from this work. One thing that I found quite fascinating in the Sejarah Malayo is that the royal bloodline of Tamasek could be traced all the way back to a union in the 4th century BC between Alexander the Great and an Indian princess. And the progeny of this relationship were these Tamasek royals. A Macedonian named Raja Iskander is spoken of in the text, and this is one of those myths where, wouldn't that have been cool if this was true? Alexander the Great, he made it as far as the Indus River, so it's not entirely out of the question that he may have impregnated an Indian princess. 16 centuries later, one of these Srivijaya royals, a prince of Palembang in southern Sumatra, one of the capitals, was the future king Sang Nila Utama, also known by his honorific title Sri Tri Buana. He sailed from Palembang through the Riau archipelago and chanced upon Temasek on one of his regional exploratory voyages. What first attracted Sang Nila Utama to the future Singapore, as the well-worn story goes, was the bright white sand whose brilliance, even from a distance, beckoned him to take a closer look. And as they got closer, Sang Nila Utama asked one of his men, "What place was this?" And he was told this was Temasek. And upon reaching the shoreline, he could have swore he saw a creature that was about the size of a goat and had the head of a lion, all black in color, and the rest of its body was red-colored, save for a white breast. It was noted that it moved quite swiftly and had vanished almost as soon as it had appeared. And one of the ministers traveling with Sang Nila Utama had said that this was some kind of lion that was local to the area. And from this story, that's how we got the name Singapore, the Lion City. It comes from the Sanskrit word Singapura. Sang Nila Utama, or Sri Tri Buana, reigned for 48 years and served as the first and most consequential of 5 kings of Singapura. Temasek, which in Old Javanese is believed to mean land surrounded by water, traded in a few rare and precious commodities. These included yellow jade and laka wood. Laka wood came from a kind of tropical aromatic tree, and Chinese trading junks were willing to sail great distances to get it. The substance was turned into incense, and the market for it in China, and no doubt elsewhere, was insatiable. And yellow jade, Well, that wasn't a mineral. It came from the casks of the helmeted hornbill, a species of hornbill native to that part of Asia. The cask of the hornbill was made up of the same stuff rhino horn is made from, namely keratin. If you're familiar with hornbills, the casque is the prominent structure found on the upper beak that gives the bird its name. I'm not sure exactly what it is about keratin byproducts, rhino horn, pangolin scales, and these hornbill casques. The hornbill casque wasn't processed into Chinese medicine. It was carved like ivory into all kinds of works of art and jewelry. These trade routes, driven by the monsoon winds, were also referred to as the ceramic route because of the massive amounts of Chinese porcelain that was very much in demand throughout the region. And once the rest of the world copped a gander at Chinese porcelain, it will become a global commodity. In previous episodes, I've mentioned the sunken treasure ship from 1,100 years ago, discovered in 1998, 600 kilometers southeast of Singapore, off the coast of Sumatra. With the exception of its ill-fated voyage back home, Arab sea merchants sailed this 18-meter-long vessel all the way from the Near East to the Far East and back. You can go see this Belitung or Batu Hitam shipwreck at the Asian Civilizations Museum on your next trip to Singapore. Due to its strategic location, about halfway in between the two greatest powers of their time, China and India, Temasek became a kind of gateway to the South China Sea in one direction and the Indian Ocean going the other way. And besides being a port that traded in these and other luxury goods, Temasek also became a trading entrepot in its own right, and Chinese vessels regularly called on this port where goods from around the region could also be purchased. The people on Tamasek received their cultural influence from the direction of India rather than China. This was also true about the religion. And along with the regularity of the monsoon winds, traders located on every node of this maritime network, one being Tamasek, continued to move goods back and forth between the major markets of the Middle East, South Asia, maritime Southeast Asia, and China. And I'll mention this for the last time in this episode at least. This was all going on long before the traders from north of the Mediterranean Sea ever knew this part of the world even existed. I'm not sure how many of you ever checked out the epic 15-part series on the history of Taiwan, but if you recall, there was someone I mentioned who lived during the Yuan Dynasty who was a kind of a Changqian character. He sailed throughout the South China Sea, Java Sea, Andaman Sea, Bay of Bengal, and the Arabian Sea 80 years before Admiral Zheng He and his treasure fleets took their famous voyages. And this man who made this epic voyage wrote about every place that he visited. And some of the earliest travel writing about the island of Taiwan came from his descriptions of the place. This was Wang Dayuan, from 1328 to 1333, during the reign of the grandson of Kublai Khan, Emperor Wenzong, Wang traveled throughout Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Two good things came of this. Firstly, he wrote this book about his travels called the Dao Yi Zhi Lue, a brief account of island barbarians. And the second good thing is that it survived into our day. And in 1330, he made a stopover in Temasek, and though practically everything up till then concerning the general situation in Singapore remained speculative, with Wang Dayuan's visit, he left some record of what he saw. Well, he wasn't there for very long, and in 1330 there wasn't really much to see. These kinds of trading entrepôts that were dependent entirely on the sea for their economy, well, the place wasn't conducive to becoming a city. And besides, Singapore was never known for its rich, fertile soil. It was always going to be what it ultimately became. Do you remember from that History of China-Cambodia Relations two-part series? I mentioned someone named Zhou Daguan, who preceded Wang Dayuan by 32 years in his travels taken at the behest of Yuan Emperor Chengzong, Temur Khan. His descriptions of Cambodia were written down in the Zhen La Feng Tu Chi, or the Customs of Cambodia. Zhen La, of course, the name the Chinese gave to Cambodia. And just as Zhou Daguan did for Cambodia, Wang Dayuan did for Singapore and other places. And we're fortunate today that we can read about these first-hand accounts of 14th century Chinese travels throughout Southeast Asia. Wang Dayuan mentioned 2 settlements in Temasek. One was called Longyamen, and the other Banzu, which was located where Fort Canning Hill is today, at the mouth of the Singapore River. Longyamen, or Dragon Teeth Gate, it's believed, was located where Keppel Harbor is today. 14th century Tamasek was protected by a wall on its northern boundary and by the Singapore River to the south, and that offered the settlement a modicum of protection. The wall that had been constructed ran the length of modern-day Stamford Road to the north side of Fort Canning Hill, and when the Brits arrived, parts of that wall were still standing. Wang Dayuan described Temasek as a minor trading port and thoroughly infested with pirates, particularly at Longyamen. He mentioned that Chinese inhabited the place and lived upstream, away from the pirates. Longyamen had been mentioned as early as the Song, and it served as a navigational landmark in the Singapore Straits, easily identifiable because of its distinctive shape. They were 2 granite rock structures that protruded like natural columns above sea level. It was an old Singapore landmark, and we'll talk more about it later. Don't go looking for it anywhere around the mouth of the Singapore River today because it ain't there anymore. Another relic from the distant past was the Singapore Stone. This was once a 2.1 by 1.5 meter slab of sandstone that dated back to sometime between the end of the Tang to the early Yuan Dynasty, before the founding of Temasek. It originally stood at the southeast part of the mouth of the Singapore River, where the history of the Lion City began. The Sejarah Melayu's history of Temasek is filled with one fantastical story after another. The tale of the Singapore Stone and how this massive boulder was hurled by someone with superhuman powers to the mouth of the Singapore River is one of those stories. What made this stone relic so important was that it was inscribed with around 50 lines of a script that, even back then, was indecipherable. It's been suggested that it may have been some ancient writing system of that region. In any case, no one was able to read it then or now, but it does attest to some sort of civilized human habitation in Singapore. And later on, as I said, when the British arrive on the scene, a slab was blowed up, and only a 37 by 74 by 15.5 centimeter fragment remains, now on display at the National Museum of Singapore. I'll come back to this again when we get to the arrival of Raffles in Part 2. If stone relics could speak, this Singapore stone would have plenty to tell us. Excavations are still going on along the Singapore River, which offer some insight into the settlement both before and after Wang Dayuan's visit. They found imperial-grade porcelain from the Ming and other items dating back to 11th century Song China. And like I said, Temasek was a trade entrepot. Goods were bought and sold there by traders who came from all around the South China Sea and beyond. So besides Chinese artifacts, among the finds that Singapore's archaeologists have made include Buddhist objects and gold coins. Yeah, the evidence is pretty clear. Traders from modern-day Vietnam, Thailand, India, and Sri Lanka all called on this port settlement located, again, at the mouth of the Singapore River. It was a melting pot back then, just as it became in the modern age. One other thing, archaeologists have determined that Fort Canning Hill was a sort of Palatine Hill of 14th century Singapore, and that this was where the elites were based, and, well, due to the artifacts being dug up there, probably where royalty resided as well. And the lower classes lived closer to the river. Regrettably, there isn't that much that archaeologists have been able to discover about Temasek, and when the British arrived and began transforming this once bustling settlement into the great port city that it later became, whatever relics were within possible reach were plowed under as a new Singapore was built on top of these medieval ruins. Temasek and Yuan Dynasty China carried out a heavy volume of trade, and when the Yuan Dynasty hit the skids, Temasek felt the impact. The sudden loss of China trade due to the traumas happening during the last decades of the Yuan Dynasty also contributed to the fall of Temasek. The Yuan Dynasty, once decline set in around the mid-14th century, and especially after the beginning of the Little Ice Age, had more on its mind than Southeast Asian trade and luxury products. The Little Ice Age was a nasty anomaly that caused a lot of unusually cold and harsh weather, which in turn led to shorter growing seasons. And this resulted in crop failures, reduced agricultural productivity, and food shortages that, in the end, opened the door for the Red Turbans and later Zhu Yuanzhang to come along in 1368 and chase the Mongols back north to where they had come from. So Wang Dayuan's 14th century chronicle, Dao Yi Zhi Lue, a brief account of island barbarians, was the first reliable record of Tamasek which we have to go on. Tamasek as a political entity didn't last terribly long, not quite a century, before it was vanquished in 1398 by the forces sent by the Maharaja of the Majapahit Empire. Who were they? Yeah, they were another formidable Hindu-Buddhist empire. It ran from 1293 to 1527. They had a warrior king named Hayam Wuruk, who ruled 1350 to 1389. He made many conquests in Southeast Asia, and it was his son who put Temasek to the sword. At its peak, the Majapahit Empire controlled almost all of Southeast Asia from Sumatra to western New Guinea. They became the next hegemonic trade entrepot in the region of Southeast Asia, with all the other coastal locations acting in the capacity of feeder ports. How Tamasek or Singapura came to an end is another one of those stories that has a number of versions, depending on whether you read Malay, Javanese, or Portuguese writings. The traditional story of the fall of Temasek involved the fifth and final king of Singapura, Iskandar Shah, Iskandar being the Malay form of the name Alexander. I mentioned that great conqueror was named as an ancient ancestor of the five kings of Singapura. Historians are pretty sure that it was during the reign of the fourth king of Singapura that Islam came to Malaysia and was embraced by the rulers and the people. Iskandar Shah was also known as Paramaswara and reigned 1389 to 1398. Now that may or may not be true. The veracity of this claim that Iskandar Shah and Paramaswara are one and the same person has still not been authenticated, but he may have been. He was descended from the Singapore founder Sang Nila Utama, and as the sordid story goes, what precipitated the fall of Singapura was an incident involving one of Iskandar Shah's concubines. She was allegedly caught cheating on His Majesty, and he had her seized, stripped naked, and put on display in the public square for all the inhabitants to ogle over. There are multiple versions of the same text, and another one says Paramaswara had her executed. Anyway, when her father, a noble who served as the royal treasurer, named Sangran Chunatapa, when he found out about his daughter's humiliation or execution, he was predictably outraged and sent a secret message to the Maharaja of Majapahit and offered to conspire with him to overthrow Iskandar Shah and deliver Temasek into his hands. The Malay Annals, or one version of this text, says the ruler of Majapahit sent an invasion force of around 300 vessels and 200,000 troops to take down Temasek. The place was rather well fortified, and the inhabitants retreated inside the protective walls. A siege ensued, and the overwhelming Javanese force was too much to defend against. And like Wu San-kwei did for the Manchus in May of 1644, the traitorous and revenge-seeking minister opened the gates to the settlement and allowed the Javanese invaders to pour in. And this ultimately put an end to Tamasek, or Singapura. The place was sacked and the people ravaged, and here is where the trail runs cold as far as what happened in Tamasek next. As for Iskandar Shah, or Parameswara, he and his subjects took to the seas and escaped to the north, up the west coast of the Malaysian Peninsula. His vessel came upon a river, and they set anchor and went ashore to inspect the place and to restock the larder with a spot of hunting. Suddenly, whilst walking through the forest, their party was attacked by a chevrotan, better known as a mouse deer. In Malay, they call this teeny-tiny species of deer a kancil. Despite its diminutive size, this mouse deer went and attacked one of the hunting party's dogs, and seeing this strange sight of such a small but ferocious animal, Iskandar Shah declared this was a sign, and with this incident, he concluded this would be the place where he shall build his new kingdom. And that, my friends, is the founding story of the great and historic city of Malacca. And if you check the coat of arms of Malacca, beside the words Persatu Teguh, strength and unity, you'll also see a couple of mouse deer as well. And for the name of this new political entity, as the king sat under a tree, he asked one of his men, "And what tree is this, whose shade I'm now enjoying?" To which he was told it was a Malacca tree, Philanthus emblica, the Indian gooseberry tree. The Malacca Sultanate was founded in or around 1400. So we can see how the Malay annals links Palembang and Srivijaya to Singapura and now to Malacca, all in one single related historical timeline. You could be sure the Portuguese and Javanese had their own version of events, perhaps less fantastical, but we can't say for sure how factual any of it is. There are multiple narratives about the history of this part of Southeast Asia, and vive la différence. So, 1398, 30 years into the Ming Dynasty, the history of Tamasek came to an end. And as Tamasek faded, one of the greatest trading and cultural centers of Southeast Asia, the Sultanate of Melaka, was born. The historical record of the Ming Shirlu, the record of the Ming Dynasty, and the Yongle Shirlu both contain ample amounts of information about the interaction between the Sultanate of Malacca and the Ming court. It all began when Iskandar Shah, that is, Parameswara, wishing to peel Malacca away from the expansionist Sukhothai kingdom, appealed to the Yongle emperor for protection in return for paying tribute to and offering his loyalty to the dynasty. In the first year of the Yongle emperor's reign, an envoy was sent from China to Malacca to establish relations. And then in 1411, the Sultan of Malacca was part of a delegation that sailed to China to bow before Yongle as a tributary state. Therefore, the following year, in 1412, Admiral Zheng He sealed the deal with the Sultan of Malacca, Parameswara, and from that point forward, into the 15th century, Malacca flourished in all its glory. Parameswara would rule for 2 more years, and his son would take over and would also cultivate the relationship with Ming China. The Sultanate of Malacca received a huge gust of wind in its sails from the Zheng He visit. In his reports, Zheng He still referred to Singapore as Danmaxi, even though the political entity no longer existed. There's also no record that he or any of his entourage visited Singapore or even sailed through the Singapore Strait. Actually, the correct term is Singapore Straits, plural, just like the newspaper, the Straits Times. These waters around Singapore were comprised of more than one single strait. The Johor Strait was to the north, the Singapore Strait to the south. And besides these 2 major arteries of water, there were also various other smaller bodies of water that served as channels and passages. Portuguese records mention the old and new Singapore Straits, one flowing north of Sentosa Island and one to the south of Sentosa. Once the British arrive on the scene, they will always refer to these waters by the plural, straits. Ship captains and navigators had to be familiar with all these straits and channels whilst navigating east and west. The old days of private trade had ended 3 years after the founding of the Ming Dynasty in 1371. A pretty hardcore isolationist, the Hongwu Emperor, centralized all foreign trade, and no longer could private merchants sail direct to ports like before. As for Tamasek, it languished as a minor outpost of the Malacca Sultanate and pretty much remained that way until the 19th century visit of Stamford Raffles. Because of the lineage between the final king of Temasek and the founding of Malacca, it remained somewhat important and wasn't allowed to completely fade from history. So bright did Malacca's star shine, it became in the 1400s not only the premier trading port in one of the richest parts of the world, it had also become a center of Islamic culture, scholarship, and learning. And due to its strategic location at the center of everything, Malacca was a convenient springboard for the continued spread of Islam throughout the region. Its location at the center of the three greatest trading regions of the South China Sea, South Asia, and West Asia, like the former Temasek, was the key to Malacca's economic success. Like Singapore, Malacca was surrounded by jungle, and the land was not suited for agriculture. It lived or died with sea trade. I mentioned in part 2 of that History of the Hokkien People episode about the story of Han Li Bao. She was no less a personage than the daughter of the Yongle Emperor, and she was sent to the 6th Sultan of Malacca, Mansur Shah, as a marriage alliance gift. As the story goes, she and her entourage of 500 high-ranking bachelors and a few hundred handmaidens all sailed to Malacca. And as a gift to his new wife, this daughter of the Ming Emperor of China, Sultan Mansur Shah built her a splendid villa called the Baoshan Ting on Bukachina Hill. San Baoshan? I read that wells still exist there that were supposedly dug in Han Li Bao's time. This is one of the many stories that came out of this great period in history just before the Europeans started showing up. And show up they did. Pardon me for not continuing on with the history of the Malacca Sultanate. Their number came up in 1511, not long after the Age of Exploration brought East and West into direct contact. By this time in the 16th century, the maritime Silk Road stretched from the Fujian coast all the way to northern Europe. It was at the dawn of the Age of Exploration that Venetian traders engaged in the trade of these exotic spices from Asia and began supplying the commodity to the European market. So great was the demand for these spices, the European trading nations of Portugal, the Netherlands, England, and later France started sailing to these seas. Some of you may recall the 1492 voyage of Christopher Columbus, who sailed westward from Spain to seek direct trade relations with Indian exporters, the main purveyor of spices. That was the main mission, but he discovered the New World instead. On the one hand, Southeast Asian trading ports received a nice adrenaline shot to the heart as far as increased trade volumes went and the opening of new and lucrative markets. But that trade, which brought even greater prosperity to the region, will be a double-edged sword as these European merchants later morphed into European colonialists. So, 1511, such an eventful year. Erasmus published The Praise of Folly. The Treaty of Westminster brought England and Aragon into an alliance against La France. Cortés and Velázquez conquered Cuba. The Spanish conquistadors were bringing the Mayan civilization to an end. But over on the coast of western Malaysia, Alfonso de Albuquerque was bringing an end to the Sultanate of Melaka. Portugal had its eye on Malacca ever since Vasco da Gama first saw the place and reported it was only 40 days' journey from India, and that the most in-demand spices of the day, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, along with other luxury items from this exotic region, could be bought and sold. This also included textiles from India's Coromandel coast that ran from Tamil Nadu on the southeast coast of India north to Andhra Pradesh. There was a first unsuccessful attempt by the Portuguese to establish trade relations with Malacca. That ended quite badly, and it directly led to the capture of the Sultanate in August 1511. The Portuguese will enjoy a fantastic run as the most consequential power in East Asia during the 16th century. But as soon as the 1600s dawn and the Dutch East India Company starts flexing its muscles, the Portuguese will give up one conquest after another until they are no longer able to remain as a major power in the European Great Game and maritime East Asia. As for Singapore, once it was captured by the Majapahit military and the political center moved up to Malacca, that place languished for centuries, mostly as a minor trading port. With the Portuguese takeover of Malacca in 1511, the Sultan of Malacca at the time, Alauddin Riyad Shah II, vacated Malacca and reconstituted the Sultanate in Johor. This was in 1528, following 17 years of conflict trying to push the Portuguese out of the future Malaysia. Johor is located adjacent to Singapore on the other side of the Johor Strait. Today there are 2 bridges that connect Singapore to Johor. The area had originally been part of the Malacca Sultanate, and after the establishment of the Johor Sultanate, Singapore fell under its control, and it stayed that way until February 6, 1819. The last milestone historical event in Singapore's history that we'll look at here in Part 1 happened in 1613 when the Portuguese, tired of being harassed by the forces of the Johor Sultanate, went on a punitive expedition and razed the settlement in Singapore to the ground. And for a couple hundred years, it sat there, as unimportant as it ever had been, until Raffles came along and saw the potential of the place. Sir Henry Pottinger, a couple decades later, will feel the same way when he first lays his eyes upon Hong Kong. And we're going to leave things here for now and pick up in Part 2 with the arrival of Sir Stamford Raffles and the early years of Singapore as a British colony. I know there wasn't that much Hong Shao Rou to sink our teeth into as far as Singapore's earliest history goes. We've been bequeathed with a lot of legends, some with contradictory narratives, but because of the times and the industriousness of Chinese, Malay, Indian, and British chroniclers and gazetteers, we won't encounter this problem for the next several episodes. I welcome you to all come back again in Part 2, where the history of the Singapore we all know and love today begins to take shape. Lots of great history and historical figures to look at next time and the time after that. I hope you'll stick with the series for as long as it takes. Until that time, mis oyentes guapos, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from searing hot Los Angeles, California. Let's meet again soon for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.